Okay, we are recording.
We've just been fighting for 45 minutes, but now we're recording.
Yeah, I should have hit recording at the beginning because it probably would have been interesting for our the few fans we have and for family members to see how we work through things, but I didn't think to hit record. So just
I'm
everybody
kind of
know.
okay with it. You know,
Yeah.
some of my arguments weren't as strong as I would have liked them to be, so not having them recorded for posterity is fine.
Yes, and I'm even worse than Sarah is about arguments, so I'm also glad that I don't come off as a doofus any more than I already do. So,
Are we
anyways.
introducing ourselves?
Oh, I'm Theo Black.
And I'm Sarah Black.
Here we go. I think I look better if I'm a little farther forward in the frame here. Anyway, so just for the record, if anybody, we were talking about 1,000 Pieces of Gold, which maybe we'll talk about again later in the wrap-up section. But what we're actually here to talk about is, I have An Actor's Revenge is going first. Is that?
Yeah, it's interesting because it almost belongs in.
Kind
it doesn't
of.
quite. Okay. So there's films that explore gender, and there's films that explore sexuality, and technically these are two different things. I mean,
Yes.
They are two different things, not just technically, but they get so tied up together sometimes.
They are closely related. They're cousins?
But there is no exploration of sexuality, I would say, in An Actor's Revenge.
Yeah, not really. There's...
So do we want to set it up a tiny bit before?
Yeah, you get to do the... I'm not even going to try doing the description of this one. You get to...
So it is
It's from
1963 film, Japanese, directed by Kon Ichikawa, who I don't know anything about, but I think he directed a very lot of films. He was one of the... Japan had its whole own studio system, right? You know.
Yeah, they had their own system. Daihei, I think it was Tohei. No, Tohei and Tohei and Daiei. Their names are similar, plus others, and it's honestly, if you think about it in terms of like the golden era of cinema in America, it's not so different. There's definitely
I imagine
differences.
this guy is not like a John Ford, but almost like, just one of those guys seems to have directed. Anyway,
yeah,
I haven't seen any of those other films to my knowledge. I'm kind of curious now, but An Actor's Revenge is about a Kabuki actor who gets revenge on someone for something that happened to his family. And that storyline is pretty standard and not that exciting on its own. But he is a Kabuki actor who is a female impersonator. And I don't know much about this, but apparently from my Wikipedia research, some of those actors would just maintain their persona outside of
they were just
stage.
always a female impersonator.
They were always a female impersonator. And I don't know if any of them were gay or anything like that, but in this film...
Or even trans, if they would
Right.
be considered trans now. I don't know if they really had the words for it then.
Right, but in this film, it's really interesting because he is a he who is...
And everybody calls him a he.
He is considered a man. He's considered manly even, as far as I can tell, by the women and the men. I think I think there might be... Sorry, a cat just tried to jump up and distracted me.
They say he's so beautiful, and they refer to him with characteristics in the subtitles that might be more feminine, but I don't know.
But he's not. There may be a few moments where he is where people talk about him behind his back, but I don't think he's diminished in the way you see a lot, where it's like, oh, he's not going to be able to fight. He's no threat. He's just a girly man. Like, there's none of that.
It's weird. He is really just, they treat him more or less equally, which is weirdly something we have to point out.
Yeah. And,
I wish we didn't, but.
2 women fall in love with him.
Yeah.
And again, what's kind of interesting about it is kind of a lack of discussion of. Yeah. Which
maybe is also something I wish didn't exist, but it is interesting that there's no discussion of it.
Yeah, no, and so it's kind of normalized, or so they say.
Yeah.
It's just, and there's something refreshing about that. On top of that, I do kind of like revenge stories, and the visuals are really interesting. So I don't know if you want to talk about the visuals.
Well, yeah, so the visuals are fascinating. So there's a lot of use of negative space, I think is what I would say, if I'm going to get hoity-toity arty about it, which
Is
is
it negative
like,
space or is it black? I feel like there's so much black in that film.
but that's it. There's a lot of use of, like, it's different than a noir where, like, the shadow is the positive space, kind of, because, like, the shadow is something you're supposed to be looking at and is supposed to be present, whereas I think of all the black and shadow, and there's usually the edges of the frame for an actor's revenge were pretty, like, it wasn't using, like, central focus or anything where they were, like, just having what's in center in focus. It was like, it'd be at night and everything above a certain wall was black, or like the ground just wouldn't be lit in a certain section. So like it was already like, it wasn't standard widescreen. It was something, I forget what it was. It might have been anamorphic or something. I don't know the technical term, but it was an even more widescreen. And on top of that, there's all this negative space where there's just black, or there's just things you're not really supposed to be looking at, like characters talking, but they're in their foreground, like they were almost felt like kitty. They almost felt like there was more of an effort to push them. So like, I thought it was really fascinating. Like, I have this theory, and I hope it's not like even a weirdly prejudicial theory, that like Japanese films pay more attention to framing in a way. They pay attention to framing in a way that is almost cultural, it seems like.
Right.
That we don't necessarily, not like, I mean, Kubrick paid a lot of attention to framing, so it's not like, but like I've seen so many different Japanese movies by different directors, and I've yet to see one where I've been like, well, I probably have, but like they all pay such close attention to framing. And I wonder if it's because there's a strong tradition of a certain kind of art style there. Like, I mean, so does Europe and US and all that, but like I'd be curious about that. But there's so much negative space used specifically in an actor's revenge to create like frames. Sarah's being crawled on by a cat. There's so much.
See if I can remove her.
There's so much emphasis on like even making this already more anamorphic, like, or whatever, frame condensed to even thinner, and even forcing the focus and the frame to even such a specific area. Like, it's a very interesting, and there's also, well, I should pause so Sarah can be here for this. We're pausing real quick. Okay, so Sarah's back now. What I was saying was there's even more of an emphasis for a frame within a frame. Like, sure, people usually use windows or something to do a frame within a frame, but this is more just like there's literal blackness, and they're putting things in focus in such a way where it feels like it's a frame within a frame, even if there isn't actually a frame within a frame. And on top of that, and a part of that, I think, is even, and I'm not as, this is more a thing you're aware of and bigger on, is color. Like, I think there's an emphasis, and they're trying with color to emphasize things and still continue to create a frame within a frame. Like, there's darker colors at the top and the bottom than there are in the center. Not as a rule, but like it was really neat. There were some really cool shots that, like,
yeah, I mean, a lot of it stuck with me. Like, there's one where the whole screen is black, and then like you see them just as these tiny figures. It felt very comic booky.
Yeah.
And, you know, and I think there's it's that hard thing of like, you know, Japan has a whole larger industry of comic books and so on. So I think, you know, we tend to talk about that a lot, and whether that's fair or not, but it did have kind of a comic booky feel to me at times. Just with like the walls that stretched on forever. And
I think that's a part of the frame within a frame thing. Like, the more a movie does that, like, other than the stereotypical like superhero stuff where, you know, in a blockbuster, if it's like superhero-y, it feels like a comic book because that's what we're kind of used to. Like, I think the more frame within a frame and the more like separated pieces of movement and action you get, I think it feels like a comic book. Because like, if you think about when you're reading a comic book, you have, you know, everything is a frame, and that makes all the action pieces feel separated also, because they usually change what we're looking at when we move to a new action piece. And I feel like that's kind of what An Actor's Revenge was doing.
Yeah, there was some interesting, I mean, it's not an action-filled film, but like, you know, you'd see like a sword, and then like it almost felt more like editing than choreography, if that makes sense, which would go with being more comic booky because it's like a frame, you know, without, you can't actually see movement in comic books. So they do it with, you know, other techniques, and it felt kind of like it might be doing something similar.
Yeah, well, the lead, whose name I'm forgetting, our female impersonator, is a sword fighter and like is a master of some sword form. I forget. And there's a subplot that I enjoy, though I'm not entirely sure how it fits into the movie or why it's there in some ways. But like where he's like fighting off this guy who was at his school and who felt wronged by him for some reason. And it doesn't make complete sense. I mean, that might be one of the few areas of the film where there is an emphasis on the fact that he's a female impersonator.
Right.
But like our lead is a master swordsman of some kind. And it's interesting, like that gives that character a level of physicality and whatnot and skill or technique that like you would like it's such a mass, like this is also like it's in, I don't know what era this would be in Japanese history, but it was probably before women's rights for a lot of things. So it's like, it wouldn't be something you'd associate with a woman necessarily, which, you know, that's wrong, but that's how it would have been in that era. So there's kind of an interesting element there too. It's like almost the idea that our character has a certain level of skill and technique gives him a certain kind of agency that he might not have had, like a woman might not have had, which again isn't fair, but is also how we look at these movies and how it might have been in this era. Anyways.
Yeah. I mean, in general, I thought the plot was probably the weakest part. It's just more interesting because we get so, to me, it was most interesting because we get so, if you are X, you cannot also be Y. If you are, and you know, so if you are a female impersonator, you cannot also be the best, you know, swords, you know, and it just kind of felt like it was refreshingly free of all that, which made it kind of interesting and fun.
Yeah, it's, you and me are people who don't really care for labels. I mean, they exist, that's fine.
Labels have a use, you know,
yeah,
I like labels for certain purposes, but
yeah, but as people, we don't ourselves prescribe to labels too much, like film fanatic, sure. But like, we don't go too much beyond that, you know? So like, it's interesting. This is almost a movie where it felt like it was not, it's not like labels are not a free thing, but when you add a label, it creates a structure and rigidity to it. There's an idea associated with it. So this almost felt like a film that was kind of label free in some ways.
Yeah.
So again, labels aren't bad or wrong or anything. It's just like there's less of a structure to it.
Yeah.
Anyways, we don't need to go into it a ton since we are doing this a little later because of our earlier argument. But An Actor's Revenge was great, and visuals, the story was really neat, even if the plot wasn't.
Yeah. I enjoyed it. I recommend it.
Me too.